The passenger, driving at night isn't for everyone. Sometimes the silence on the streets feels almost comforting. Other times, it's oppressive, as if the world is watching you from the shadows. I never thought a rideshare shift could bring me so close to something I can only describe as the inexplicable. But that night, everything changed. My name is Claire. I'm a rideshare driver in a small New England town, a place that looks like it came straight out of a postcard in the fall, but in the winter it turns into something much darker. The snow blankets everything in a white veil, hiding details, dangers, and maybe secrets. I live with my 7-year-old daughter Sophia, who's the light of my life. Sophia loves to draw, always bringing me doodles of trees, flowers, and little stick figures. For the longest time, I assumed they were all just depictions of our family. Driving at night became my escape. The quiet streets gave me time to think and a chance to pick up extra rides. After all, rent doesn't pay itself. That's what I thought until that night. I accepted a ride request at 11:45 p.m. The pickup point was near Pine Hill Cemetery. I frowned. Everyone in town knew the stories about that place. They said it was cursed, that no one should wander near it at night. Nonsense, I thought. Tales to scare kids. Reality is always scarier than any ghost story. When I arrived, the GPS led me to a dimly lit corner where the streetlights flickered more than they illuminated. The cemetery loomed nearby, its gates hidden beneath dense trees. Nothing moved, except for the wind that made dry leaves dance along the pavement. I glanced around. No one was there. Great, another no-show, I muttered just as I heard the back door open. Ashwood Park! And hurry! A voice said, male, dry, and commanding. I instinctively looked in the rearview mirror. Nothing, just an empty seat. I blinked, confused, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Sir, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I said Ashwood Park, the voice repeated, closer this time, almost as if it was inside my head. I drove in silence. The radio started crackling, static growing louder by the minute. A strange smell filled the car, wet earth mixed with something sweet, almost metallic. Streetlights flickered as I passed, plunging the road into stretches of total darkness. You work so hard, Claire, the voice said, clearly from the back seat now. My hands trembled on the wheel. How do you know my name? I asked, glancing at the mirror. A shadow was there now, a figure with glowing blue eyes that pierced through the darkness. You've forgotten, haven't you? What you promised that night. My mind spun. Promised what? I wanted to stop the car, but it felt like the wheel was glued to my hands. The radio cut out completely. The only sounds were his heavy breathing and mine. The shadow moved, and when I looked again, he was leaning forward close enough that I could feel the chill radiating from him. Please, let me go, I whispered. You're not going anywhere until I get what's mine, he replied. My body was frozen. The car sped up on its own, taking us down a deserted road that led into Ashwood Park. I tried the brakes, but the pedals didn't respond. When the car finally stopped, the back door opened. We'll meet again, he said before disappearing into the darkness. Silence enveloped the car. I glanced at the back seat and saw something that wasn't there before. One of Sophia's drawings. It showed her holding hands with the same figure I had just seen, his glowing eyes and chilling presence unmistakable. I raced home, panic clawing at me. When I arrived, Sophia was asleep on the couch, clutching the same drawing. Sophia! I called, my voice shaky. She opened her eyes slowly and smiled, a smile that felt wrong. He said you were brave, Mommy. But it's not over yet. The next morning, something felt different. Sophia seemed calm, but that eerie smile lingered on her face. The drawing remained on the kitchen table, but now there was a new detail I swear wasn't there before. Behind Sophia and the glowing-eyed figure was a larger shadow, watching over them. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination, but as the day went on, little things started happening. The kitchen radio, which hadn't worked in months, turned on by itself, emitting soft static. The clock in the living room was stuck at 11:45 p.m., no matter how many times I reset it. Sophia drew more than usual, but she never showed me what she was working on. That night, as I washed dishes, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I assumed it was Sophia, but when I turned around, the hallway was empty. Her bedroom door, however, was slightly ajar. "Sophia!" I called, my voice barely a whisper. There was no response. As I approached, I heard voices. It wasn't just Sophia talking. There was another voice, low and guttural, answering her questions. Peeking through the crack in the door, I saw Sophia sitting on the floor, surrounded by drawings. The pages were filled with black and white figures. Her and that mysterious man. Some showed even darker shapes, faceless eyes, hands reaching out from the shadows. When I pushed the door open, she looked up at me with a calm expression. "Do you want to meet him, Mommy?" she asked, holding up one of the drawings. Before I could answer, the lights flickered and the room plunged into sudden darkness. The next thing I knew, I was back on that deserted road. The car was parked where I had left the passenger. The engine was off and the keys were nowhere to be found. On the passenger seat, Sophia's drawing was pinned down with a small stone. On the back, written in handwriting I didn't recognize, were the words, "We'll return when she's ready." I raced home, confused and terrified. When I got there, Sophia was asleep on the couch, the drawing resting beside her. The living room radio played a slow, unfamiliar tune that felt oddly familiar. But the strangest thing? The clock still read 11:45 p.m. Since then, my nights have been a blur of shadows and whispers. Sophia seems to know something she isn't telling me. Sometimes I catch her staring down the empty hallway as if waiting for someone. And on some nights, when I wake in the early hours, I feel like there's something standing at my bedroom door, watching. But every time I look, there's nothing there. Or maybe I just can't see it. Drawn from the ashes. Have you ever seen something so disturbing you can't forget it no matter how hard you try? Something so strange, so visceral, that no amount of rationalizing can push it out of your mind? That's exactly what happened to me that fall of 2016 in a small New Hampshire town when Finch showed me his drawing. My name is Jeff, and I'm a third-grade teacher at a public school in Concord, New Hampshire. The classroom was small, decorated with children's artwork and educational posters. On that Friday morning in October, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the whiteboard and rows of desks that felt a bit cramped for my 24 students. Fall is my favorite time of year. Falling leaves, crisp air, and the kids' excitement for the approaching Halloween. Little did I know that day would change my life. Every Friday, I ran an activity called Draw and Tell. The idea was simple: give the kids a space to express their thoughts and stories through art. It was always a fun time filled with drawings of dogs, houses, and the occasional unicorn. But that morning, something felt different. Finch, a 6-year-old boy with messy blonde hair and a frame smaller than most kids his age, was sitting in the corner, gripping his colored pencils like they were precious weapons. He wasn't the type of child who stood out, always quiet, always in the background. But on that Friday, he drew more attention than usual. The classroom had that unmistakable smell of freshly sharpened pencils and scattered paper. Normally, that scent brought me comfort, a reminder of the simple and honest purpose of my work. But that day, something felt off. It was like an invisible weight hung in the air, something I couldn't pinpoint, but that made the hairs on my neck stand up. The kids were scattered across the room, drawing silently or chatting softly with their friends. It was a routine activity, one we repeated every semester, but my eyes kept drifting back to Finch. He was sitting alone at a desk in the back, his head down, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Finch was always more of an observer than a participant. What really caught my attention, though, were his hands. They moved frantically, almost desperately, as he gripped a red pencil. The sound of graphite scratching paper carried a strange urgency, out of place in the otherwise calm atmosphere. He pressed the pencil so hard that I feared the tip would snap at any moment. Around him, some kids began whispering and giggling, pointing at whatever he was drawing. "Mr. Jeff," one of the students called out in a conspiratorial whisper, "look at what Finch is drawing." I walked over, curious and slightly apprehensive. What could possibly be so strange that it would provoke laughter? When I finally stood behind him and looked down at his paper, my heart skipped a beat. This wasn't an ordinary child's drawing. It was a chaotic, haunting scene. Red and orange flames rising violently, consuming what was unmistakably a house. Tiny black dots in the windows gave the impression of human figures, but they weren't moving. They were frozen, trapped. For a moment, I was speechless. This wasn't something you expect to see in a drawing by a 6-year-old. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my voice calm. "Finch," I said softly, "what are you drawing?" He didn't look up, but his answer came immediately and plainly. "My house on fire." The words hung in the air, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. I tried to process what he had just said. "Your house on fire?" I asked, forcing a smile to avoid scaring him. "Yes," he said, finally looking up. His eyes seemed far too old for someone so young. "That's how it happened. They set it on fire, with me inside." For a moment, I forgot to breathe. The hallway outside the classroom suddenly felt colder, as if the air had been drained of warmth. Finch held the paper carefully, like it was a secret too heavy for him to carry alone. I looked into his eyes, searching for anything, any sign that this was just a story, a creation of his young, imaginative mind. But what I found was something far more unsettling. Certainty. He believed every word. "Can you tell me more, Finch?" "When did this happen?" I asked, keeping my tone steady, though every part of me screamed to back away. He clutched the paper tighter, hesitating as if the next detail would lead him into uncharted territory. "It was at night. They said I'd been bad. I went to my room and then the fire started, but I got out. I always get out." The way he said "I always get out" made my stomach churn. There was something strange about the phrase, an eerie familiarity, as if this wasn't the first time. My mind tried to rationalize, but his calm voice defied all logic. "Your parents, were they in the house too?" I almost didn't want to hear the answer. He shook his head slowly. "They were outside, watching. But it's not always them. Sometimes it's something else." My breath caught in my throat. "Something else?" I asked, my voice faltering as the words stumbled out. He looked at me, and for the first time his expression changed. His normally wide, vacant eyes seemed deeper, darker. "It's not always them, but it's someone who likes fire. He likes to watch me get out. He likes to watch me get out." Those words hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to ask who he was, but something inside me hesitated. It felt like opening that door would invite something I wasn't ready to face. "Finch," I began carefully, trying to steady the tremor in my voice, "what does he look like?" Finch stared at the floor, his small feet swinging slightly beneath the bench. "He doesn't have a face, but he has big hands. And he holds a light." "A light?" "Yes, a light that gets bigger and bigger until it eats everything." He moved his hands as if shaping something invisible in the air, his face a mix of fascination and fear. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just what Finch was saying. It was how he said it, as if he was describing something he had seen hundreds of times, something he knew intimately. "Finch, have you told anyone else about this?" I asked, my voice now a little firmer. He looked up, staring at me as if I'd just asked the strangest question in the world. "Nobody cares. You're the only one who asked." Before I could respond, the school bell rang, breaking the heavy silence in the hallway. Finch slid off the bench, holding his drawing, and walked back to the classroom. "I have to finish my drawing," he said, his calmness almost unsettling. I watched him go, the paper dangling loosely in his hand. My eyes followed him until he disappeared through the door. Something deep inside me told me this wasn't over. Back at my desk, the image of the fire in the house wouldn't leave my mind. I wanted to convince myself it was just the imagination of a child, but there was something in Finch's tone, something that felt more real than it should. Later that day, as I organized the drawings to store them, I noticed something that made my heart race. In the corner of Finch's drawing, almost imperceptible, was a faint outline. A tall, faceless figure with long arms and what looked like flames in its hands. I knew I hadn't seen it before, but it was there. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't shake the image of that figure. It's just a drawing, I told myself. Just a drawing. But when I got home, something felt off. The lights in my living room flickered, even though I'd replaced the bulbs last week. And when I opened the door, the faint smell of something burning filled the air. Subtle, but unmistakable. My breath grew heavier as I walked through the house, searching for the source. And then I saw it. Sitting on the kitchen table, carefully folded, was Finch's drawing. And in the corner, beside the faceless figure, there was something new, a name written in shaky, childlike handwriting. Jeff. The portrait beyond the grave. If there's one thing I've learned as a parent, it's that kids have a peculiar way of turning the ordinary into something extraordinary, sometimes magical, other times deeply unsettling. My 6-year-old daughter Debbie embodies this. She has a natural talent for capturing the world in her drawings, as if the paper were a window to her soul. Our walls are covered with her creations. Houses with triangular roofs, cats that are hilariously oversized, and versions of us with smiles that stretch across our faces. I've always found it charming. Until the day I found that drawing. A drawing that made me question whether I truly knew my own daughter. It was a quiet autumn evening, the kind where the air carries the woody scent of falling leaves and the crackling fire in the hearth fills the house with a cozy warmth. Debbie was sitting on the living room floor, her Crayola pencil set spread out like a treasure chest. She was scribbling on a blank sheet of paper, her eyes focused, her tongue sticking out slightly, a habit she had whenever she was deep in concentration. Erin, my wife, was in the kitchen finishing up a batch of cookies, and I was reading an old book I'd picked up at a local fair. It was an ordinary night, or so I thought. "Daddy, I'm done," Debbie announced, holding up her drawing like a trophy. She ran over to me and handed me the paper with that innocent smile only kids can pull off. But the moment my eyes landed on the drawing, my stomach turned. This wasn't a house or a cat this time. It was a portrait of Debbie holding hands with a woman I'd never seen before. The woman had long brown hair, piercing blue eyes, and wore a flowing white dress that seemed almost alive on the paper. There was something about the details, the precision, that felt beyond a child's skill. "Who's this?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "It's Lucia," Debbie replied, as if she were telling me the name of her doll. The name echoed in my mind, strange, out of place. "Lucia?" I repeated, hoping it would help me understand. "Who is Lucia, Debbie?" "She visits me," she said, already back on the floor grabbing another piece of paper. "Sometimes at night when I'm drawing." Her answer should have reassured me. Imaginary friend, I thought. Every kid has one, right? But there was something in her tone, in the way she said it, that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the playful, excited voice she usually used to spin her stories. When Erin walked into the room carrying a plate of steaming cookies, I showed her the drawing. The moment I said the name Lucia, something shifted in her expression. She went pale, her lips tightening, and her eyes fixed on the paper as if it held some terrible secret. "Clay," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Lucia was my sister." I blinked, confused. "Your sister?" She nodded slowly, her gaze still locked on the drawing. She died long before Debbie was born. The room seemed to grow colder, the fire's warmth unable to chase away the chill that ran down my spine. I looked at Debbie, who was once again engrossed in her drawing, as if none of this were unusual. But how could she know about this? You've never told me about Lucia. There aren't any photos, no mentions of her in this house. Erin didn't answer. Instead, she clutched the drawing to her chest as if trying to shield herself from memories she'd buried long ago. In that moment, I realized something was deeply, terribly wrong. Lucia was my sister. Those words echoed in the room, a revelation I hadn't expected. Erin held the drawing tightly, her fingers trembling, as if the paper might protect her from whatever truth it carried. But, Erin, I began, struggling to keep calm as my heart raced. How could Debbie know this? You've never spoken about Lucia. We don't even have pictures of her in the house, not even a mention. Erin avoided my gaze, staring into the empty space above the fire. The flames crackled softly, but their heat couldn't seem to reach the icy atmosphere that had settled over the room. I know, she finally said, her voice trembling. That's why this doesn't make any sense. Debbie has no way of knowing about her. I glanced at Debbie, still sitting on the floor with her sketch pad. She was scribbling on another page, her tongue sticking out again, as if the tension between Erin and me didn't exist. The contrast between her peaceful focus and the oppressive weight in the room was almost unbearable. You're telling me she drew Lucia with this kind of detail? My voice came out louder than I intended, and Debbie glanced up briefly before returning to her work. She had bright blue eyes, a small mark above her lip. Erin hesitated, her face pale under the flickering light of the lamp. And the white dress? She was buried in it? Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My brain refused to process it. I looked back at the drawing, the woman's blue eyes seeming to stare back at me, almost mocking. This can't be real. There has to be an explanation. Erin didn't reply. She stood up slowly, clutching the drawing tightly. I need to think, she said before disappearing down the hallway, leaving me alone with Debbie and the suffocating feeling that something was very, very wrong. I sat there for several minutes, listening to the heavy silence that filled the house. The clock on the wall read 8:47 p.m., but it felt much later. Finally, I approached Debbie and sat down beside her on the carpet. Debbie, I began, trying to keep my voice light despite the knot in my throat. Can you tell me more about Lucia? She stopped drawing and turned to me, her innocent eyes serious. She likes to visit me, she said, as if talking about a neighbor dropping by for coffee. She told me she misses Mommy. A chill ran down my spine. What else did she say? She likes my drawings, Debbie replied, turning back to her paper. She said she wants to see more. What she said next made my blood run cold. And she wants me to draw you, Daddy. My hands went numb. What did that mean? Debbie had drawn me before. Silly, disproportionate caricatures that now felt safe and ordinary compared to whatever this was. But the way she said it, like it was a direct request from someone real. Why, Debbie? Why does she want you to draw me? She looked at me, her expression calm, almost like an adult explaining something obvious to a child. She said she needs a picture of you to get to know you better. The days that followed were strangely normal. Debbie went back to her routine of drawing cheerful houses and grinning cats. Erin and I didn't speak about Lucia, as if silence was the only defense we had against what had happened. But something gnawed at me, a deep unease I couldn't shake. Sometimes at night I'd check on Debbie to make sure she was asleep. Every time I found her with a pencil in her hand, my stomach turned. It wasn't the act of drawing that scared me. It was the feeling that she was never really drawing alone. One night, as I opened her door, I froze. Debbie was sitting on the floor frantically sketching. Beside her was an unfinished drawing, a faceless woman, except for two bright blue eyes that seemed to leap off the page. The darkness in the corner of her room seemed to pulse like something alive. "Debbie?" I called, my voice trembling. She looked up at me, but her expression was empty, distant. Without saying a word, she pointed to the darkest corner of the room. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something made me turn my head. That's when I saw it, a tall feminine figure with long hair and a white dress, staring at me with eyes that weren't there. In the next instant, the figure vanished, and Debbie calmly returned to her drawing, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't my imagination. Lucia had never left, and somehow, I knew she wanted much more than just drawings.